There is a certain kind of silence that hangs in the air when a Hollywood legend decides to finally speak. At 67 years old, Ava Gardner sat with her memories spread before her like old photographs, some sharp, some faded, all charged with the weight of a life lived in the spotlight. She had been the barefoot beauty, the goddess on the screen, the woman men adored and women admired. Yet beneath the stardust and the perfume of fame was a woman who, for decades, had kept parts of her story hidden. And one of the names that rose again and again in her memory was Humphrey Bogart. Bogart was more than a movie star. He was the hard-boiled cynic who somehow carried a bruised romantic's heart. He was Rick in Casablanca, Sam Spade in The Maltese Falcon, the face carved into America's cinematic memory. For most people, Bogart belonged to Bacall, his screen partner, his great love, his legend. But for Ava, he was something else, a mirror, a confidant, a presence she could never quite put into words. As the years stretched on, Hollywood had changed. The golden era had crumbled, the studio gates no longer sealed their secrets, and the world was hungry for revelations. Ava knew that when she finally spoke, the world would lean in close, straining to catch each word. What had Bogart been to her? A friend. A secret love. A fellow traveler through the dangerous corridors of fame. She had carried the answers quietly through marriages, affairs, scandals, and exile in Spain and London. But at 67, her health failing and her patience with silence gone, she was ready to peel back the curtain. The story she told was not simple. It was tinged with admiration, but also laced with regret. It was about the Bogart the cameras never captured, the one with weary eyes, biting humor, and moments of fragile honesty. Ava hinted at conversations long forgotten by everyone else but her. She teased that behind the smoke-filled rooms and witty one-liners, there was a man she understood in ways others perhaps did not. And in turn, Bogart had understood her. This is not the story you've read in magazines or seen splashed across glossy studio posters. This is not just the myth of Bogey and Bacall, nor the scandal-filled gossip columns that tried to reduce Ava Gardner to a string of lovers. This is a story that lives in the shadows between truth and rumor, memory and myth. At 67, Ava Gardner did not offer us tidy answers. What she gave us was something rarer, a confession, a whisper, a late-life revelation that forces us to rethink the legends we thought we knew. And so we begin, not with the Hollywood fairytale, but with Ava's voice at the end of it all, finally speaking up about the man who shaped part of her story. Humphrey Bogart. Ava Gardner's story began in the red clay soil of Grabtown, North Carolina, a speck of a place that even maps had trouble locating. Born on December 24, 1922, she came into the world during a winter marked by poverty and hard labor. Her parents, Jonas and Mary Elizabeth Gardner, were sharecroppers, bound to the land but never truly owning it. Ava was the youngest of 7 children, raised in a farmhouse with no electricity, no running water, and few luxuries beyond the love and stubborn pride that kept the family going. From the start, life was hard. The Great Depression tore through rural America, leaving families like the Gardners scraping by on meager harvests and odd jobs. Ava's father, a tobacco farmer, later worked in a sawmill. Her mother, known as Molly, took in boarders to supplement the family's income. The Gardner home was crowded, noisy, and perpetually busy. Yet within that whirlwind, Ava grew up with a mix of grit and humor that never quite left her. She was not the glamorous figure the world would later worship. In childhood, she was a barefoot, freckle-faced tomboy, running wild through fields, climbing trees, and coming home with skinned knees. Money was tight, but she carried herself with a natural confidence. The family's Baptist faith instilled discipline, while the closeness of her siblings gave her a sense of loyalty and defiance. She learned early that survival meant toughness, an attitude that later separated her from many of her Hollywood contemporaries. Tragedy came too soon. Ava's father, Jonas, died of bronchitis when she was still a teenager. His passing forced the family into deeper hardship and left an imprint on Ava's sense of loss. Her mother moved the family to Newport News, Virginia, where she ran a boarding house for shipyard workers. It was a noisy, unglamorous place, but Ava carried her southern warmth and raw beauty like a hidden flame. Even then, people noticed her striking features: luminous green eyes, jet black hair, and the kind of bone structure that seemed sculpted rather than born. Ava never planned on Hollywood. In fact, she was shy, soft-spoken, and had a heavy Southern drawl that many dismissed as unpolished. After high school, she attended secretarial school in Wilson, North Carolina, intending nothing more glamorous than clerical work. But fate has a way of sneaking in through side doors. In 1939, she visited her sister Beatrice in New York City. BEA's husband, Larry Tarr, happened to be a professional photographer. Struck by Ava's beauty, he insisted on taking her portrait. That photograph, simple, unposed, yet arresting, set the wheels of destiny turning. Larry Tarr displayed Ava's picture in the window of his photography studio in Manhattan. It caught the eye of a passerby who worked for Loew's Theatres, the parent company of MGM. Soon, Ava's face was being talked about in studio offices thousands of miles away. An MGM talent scout arranged a screen test. The film was silent. No one cared about her thick Southern accent yet. What mattered was that her face lit up the camera. She was signed to a 7-year contract. Ava Gardner, the sharecropper's daughter, was suddenly under the wing of one of Hollywood's most powerful studios. Her early years in Hollywood were far from glamorous. Ava was just another contract player in the MGM machine. She was given diction lessons to soften her Carolina accent, acting coaches to polish her rough edges, and bit parts in films where she often went uncredited. She played showgirls, secretaries, background beauties, faces the audience might notice but never remember. MGM executives were unsure what to do with her. She was stunning, yes, but shy. She rarely spoke up, and when she did, her accent made directors wince. For a while, it seemed she might fade into the background, one of the countless pretty faces lost in the studio system. But the camera never lied. Even when silent, even when relegated to the margins of a scene, Ava radiated something magnetic. Colleagues began to notice. Clark Gable once remarked that she had it, that impossible to define quality that separated stars from extras. MGM, cautious but curious, kept her under contract, waiting for the right role. That role came in 1946 with The Killers, a gritty film noir based on an Ernest Hemingway short story. Cast opposite Burt Lancaster, Ava played Kitty Collins, the classic femme fatale, seductive, dangerous, irresistible. The performance electrified audiences. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her presence, cool, mysterious, edged with vulnerability, that made her unforgettable. Overnight, she went from starlet to star. Hollywood had found its new goddess. The transformation was complete, at least in the public eye. Magazine covers declared her the world's most beautiful animal. Studio press agents spun tales of exotic allure, painting her as a glamorous temptress. Yet behind the studio-crafted image was still the girl from Grabtown, fiercely independent, a little awkward, and deeply distrustful of Hollywood's artifice. She never forgot where she came from. When asked later about her meteoric rise, Ava would shrug and say, "I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." Fame didn't erase her shyness. She hated doing interviews, loathed posing for staged photographs, and often described herself as plain compared to her contemporaries. Unlike other actresses who relished publicity, Ava ducked from it whenever possible. Friends described her as earthy, unpretentious, and hilariously blunt. She swore freely, drank heartily, and carried herself with a no-nonsense attitude that confounded her studio handlers. Hollywood adored her face but struggled with her soul. She was not the pliant, obedient starlet they preferred. She spoke her mind, resisted control, and lived as she pleased. This tension between image and reality defined much of her career. To the public, she was a screen goddess, a fantasy. To those who knew her, she was still Ava from North Carolina, stubborn, sharp-tongued, and deeply human. Her path from Grabtown to Hollywood was a story of chance encounters and raw magnetism, but it was also a story of resilience. Every step forward, through poverty, tragedy, anonymity, and reluctant stardom, was a reminder that Ava Gardner's beauty was only part of her power. Beneath it lay a toughness born from tobacco fields and boarding houses, a toughness that would serve her well in the turbulent years to come. For the young girl who once roamed barefoot in rural North Carolina, Hollywood must have seemed like another planet. Yet as the lights of stardom burned brighter around her, Ava never let herself forget that she had come from dust and sweat, not diamonds. And perhaps it was that memory, that stubborn tether to her roots, that made her unlike any other star of her time. She was both goddess and farm girl, both myth and woman. And that duality would shape every chapter of her life, including the quiet, complicated story she shared with Humphrey Bogart. If Ava Gardner's life began in the fields of North Carolina, Humphrey Bogart started on the manicured sidewalks of Manhattan's Upper West Side. Born on December 25, 1899, Christmas Day, Bogart entered the world in comfort, though not without complications. His father, Dr. Belmont D. Forrest Bogart, was a respected heart surgeon. His mother, Maud Humphrey, was a celebrated illustrator whose artwork graced magazines and advertising campaigns. The Bogarts lived in a brownstone, kept a summer home on Canandaigua Lake in upstate New York, and expected their children to embody a polished, upper-class respectability. But privilege did not guarantee happiness. Humphrey's parents were distant, often cold. His mother, though accomplished, was strict and demanding. She used young Humphrey as a model for her sketches, dressing him in sailor suits and sketching his serious little face for advertisers. He grew up resenting her ambition, her detachment, and the way she seemed to view him as material for her art rather than simply her son. His father, often consumed by his medical practice, was a stern figure prone to silence. Home, for young Bogart, was elegant but emotionally sparse. He was sent to elite schools, Trinity School in Manhattan, then the prestigious Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, with the hope that he might one day attend Yale and follow a respectable professional path. But Bogart was not a scholar. He was restless, rebellious, and utterly uninterested in textbooks. By his own admission, he was expelled from Phillips Academy, the reasons clouded in conflicting accounts. Some said he was caught drinking, others that he misbehaved too freely. Whatever the truth, his chance at Yale evaporated. The carefully laid plans of his parents dissolved, and Humphrey was suddenly untethered. World War I offered an escape. In 1918, still a teenager, Bogart enlisted in the U.S. Navy. He served as a seaman aboard the USS Leviathan, a troopship ferrying soldiers across the Atlantic. The Navy gave him discipline, adventure, and a sense of independence he had never known. It also gave him the scar that would become part of his legend. While on duty, a prisoner tried to escape and, in the struggle, Bogart was injured. Some accounts say by shrapnel, others claim a sailor struck him with handcuffs. The injury left him with a slight scar on his upper lip, producing the characteristic lisp that later audiences would recognize instantly. After the war, Bogart drifted. He tried odd jobs, worked briefly in stockbroking, and eventually found himself drawn to theater. At first, it was not acting but stage management that paid his bills. He worked backstage, handling props and cues, immersing himself in the mechanics of live performance. Slowly, however, he drifted toward acting. He had the looks, tall, lean, with sharp features, and in the 1920s, he began securing small parts in Broadway productions. His early roles were far from glamorous. Bogart played handsome juveniles, upper-class suitors, the sort of clean-cut young men directors assumed matched his background. Yet he struggled with these parts. There was something about Bogart, an edge, a streetwise cynicism, that clashed with the wholesome roles he was given. Critics often dismissed him as stiff or unconvincing. Still, he worked steadily, building a reputation as a reliable if unremarkable actor. The Great Depression devastated Broadway, and by the 1930s, stage work was scarce. Like many New York actors, Bogart drifted to Hollywood, hoping to find steadier paychecks. The studios put him under contract, but the early years were disheartening. He appeared in a string of forgettable films, usually playing supporting roles, doctors, businessmen, second-build romantic leads. He was competent, but there was no spark. MGM and Fox didn't quite know what to do with him. Then came a turning point, a role that forever shifted his trajectory. Duke Mantee in The Petrified Forest. First performed on Broadway in 1935, the play cast Bogart as a ruthless escaped gangster, holding hostages in a desert diner. The role was ferocious, menacing, magnetic. Finally, Bogart's natural intensity and rough edges found their place. The part fit him like a glove. Audiences took notice. When the play was adapted for film in 1936, Warner Brothers initially resisted casting Bogart, preferring a bigger name. But Leslie Howard, the film's star, insisted on Bogart reprising the role. Warner relented, and The Petrified Forest hit theaters with Bogart's unforgettable performance at its core. It was a revelation. At last, he had found his archetype. No more bland leading men or stuffy professionals. Humphrey Bogart was born to play the outlaw, the tough guy, the loner whose sharp wit masked deeper wounds. For several years, Warner Brothers typecast him mercilessly. He played gangster after gangster, henchman after henchman. In Angels with Dirty Faces, Marked Woman, Kid Galahad, and The Roaring Twenties, Bogart was often gunned down before the credits rolled. He grew frustrated, watching friends like James Cagney and Edward G. Robinson land the meaty leading roles while he languished as the supporting villain. Yet even in these parts, audiences noticed him. There was something more in his eyes than mere menace, something wounded, weary, and real. By the early 1940s, his persistence paid off. John Huston's High Sierra, 1941, gave Bogart his first major lead as Roy Earle, a doomed outlaw whose toughness hid a flicker of compassion. That same year, The Maltese Falcon catapulted him into stardom. As Private Detective Sam Spade, Bogart embodied a new archetype. Cynical yet principled, tough yet vulnerable, a man navigating a corrupt world with his own code of honor. The following year sealed his fate. In 1942, Casablanca premiered. As Rick Blaine, the jaded nightclub owner in wartime Morocco, Bogart delivered what would become one of cinema's most enduring performances. The role crystallized everything that made him unique: the world-weary cool, the clipped dialogue, the bitter wit, and, beneath it all, a romantic soul. Audiences around the world fell in love with Bogart, not because he was flawless, but because he was flawed in ways they recognized. From then on, Humphrey Bogart was no longer a supporting player. He was a leading man, a box office draw, and a cultural icon. Films like To Have and Have Not, 1944, The Big Sleep, 1946, Key Largo, 1948, and The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, 1948, cemented his legend. In 1951, his role opposite Katharine Hepburn in The African Queen won him his only Academy Award, further proving his versatility. Yet the essence of his appeal remained the same. He was the tough guy who revealed vulnerability in fleeting moments, the cynic who longed for decency, the loner who carried the scars of life but still fought for something, anything, worth believing in. In an era of glossy matinee idols, Bogart offered grit. In a town of carefully crafted illusions, he gave authenticity. By the time Ava Gardner was emerging as MGM's newest goddess, Humphrey Bogart had already etched himself into Hollywood's pantheon. He was no longer the awkward rich kid or the struggling Broadway actor. He was Bogey, the screen's ultimate tough guy, an icon of masculine cool whose shadow stretched across an entire generation of cinema. And it was in this incarnation, at the peak of his powers, that his path would begin to cross with Ava's. The Southern farm girl and the Manhattan rebel, two lives shaped by such different beginnings, were about to orbit the same sun, Hollywood. By the late 1940s, Hollywood was at its shimmering zenith, a dream factory built on celluloid and smoke, where legends walked down studio corridors and gossip was as much a currency as the dollar. The city of Los Angeles pulsed with the glow of neon marquees, the clink of martini glasses at Musso and Frank's, and the flashbulbs that turned every movie premiere into a national event. Stars weren't just entertainers, they were demigods in tailored suits and satin gowns, their lives scrutinized in fan magazines, whispered about in salons, and broadcast in newsreels. It was into this glittering kingdom that Ava Gardner, the barefoot girl from Grabtown, had ascended. By the late 40s, she was more than just MGM's latest discovery. She was a phenomenon. Her beauty was legendary. Alabaster skin, emerald eyes, and a sultry magnetism that even cameras struggled to capture in full. Yet she carried herself with a mixture of innocence and rebellion. Ava was as comfortable barefoot on a Carolina porch as she was draped in mink at the Coconut Grove. That contradiction fascinated people, especially men. Humphrey Bogart, meanwhile, was no longer clawing for recognition. He had it in spades. Casablanca had made him immortal, The Maltese Falcon had solidified his brand of cool cynicism, and To Have and Have Not had introduced him to his great love, Lauren Bacall. By the time Gardner was appearing in splashy MGM musicals and smoldering noir pictures, Bogart was at the peak of his career and influence. He was Bogey, the tough guy with a heart, the man every other actor envied and every audience adored. And in that peculiar ecosystem known as Hollywood's Golden Age, their orbits began to overlap. Studios in those years were sprawling kingdoms. Warner Brothers, MGM, Paramount, and 20th Century Fox were not just employers. They were empires with enormous backlots, commissaries that buzzed like town squares, and armies of actors under contract. Crossing paths was inevitable. At night, they might both be at Romanoff's, Hollywood's chicest restaurant, or trading stories at the famed Mocambo nightclub, where zebra-striped walls and Latin rhythms provided a backdrop for stardust encounters. People remembered Ava's first impressions of Bogart. He was smaller than she expected, wiry rather than imposing, with sharp features and an unmistakable air of self-possession. His laugh, raspy from cigarettes and bourbon, cut through a crowd. Ava herself was shy at first in such circles. Despite her growing fame, she often felt like an outsider among Hollywood's polished set, preferring plain speech and direct humor to cocktail party sophistication. But Bogart, with his disdain for phoniness and his love of plain talk, intrigued her. At parties, Bogart often held court with his sharp wit, while Ava, stunning in silk gowns, tended to listen more than speak. Yet when she did speak, her down-to-earth honesty startled people. One oft-told anecdote has Bogart raising a glass in mock salute to Ava after she bluntly told a pompous producer to go to hell, a boldness few dared in those days. Bogart loved that about her. "Kid's got guts," he was overheard saying. Hollywood gossip columns, those endless pages of speculation penned by Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, began to note the occasions when Bogart and Gardner were spotted in the same place. Sometimes it was at the Brown Derby, other times at informal poker nights that Bogart hosted with friends. Were they simply colleagues sharing the same social circuit, or was there more? The whispers never quite died down. Their first clear professional crossing came during studio gatherings, when MGM loaned actors to Warner Brothers or vice versa. Bogart and Gardner shared acquaintances in nearly every circle. Directors like John Huston, actors like Frank Sinatra, and screenwriters who floated between the two. Huston, in particular, was a key link. A man of appetite and adventure, Huston adored Ava's spirit and Bogart's companionship. He often invited them both to rowdy dinner parties that spilled into dawn. One night in particular has been immortalized in memoirs. Huston hosted a gathering in his Laurel Canyon home, with Bogart chain-smoking in the corner and Ava dancing barefoot to a scratchy jazz record. At some point, Bogart is said to have quipped, "You dance like you fight, reckless but damned beautiful." It was a throwaway line, but one that fueled endless speculation about whether their rapport was purely friendly or tinged with something deeper. What made the whispers so persistent was the undeniable chemistry. Ava's beauty was obvious, but what Bogart seemed to appreciate was her unvarnished honesty. She cursed like a sailor, drank with the men, and refused to play the part of a delicate Hollywood flower. Bogart, who loathed artifice, found that refreshing. For her part, Ava respected Bogart's toughness, not the on-screen kind, but the resilience behind it. He had clawed his way up, been typecast, dismissed, and had finally carved out a place in a brutal industry. She knew something about fighting for survival, too. In truth, the bond between them hovered somewhere between attraction and camaraderie. They shared a sensibility. Two outsiders who never quite belonged to the glittering world they had conquered. Bogart had grown up privileged but emotionally neglected. Ava had grown up poor but fiercely loved by her family. Both had spent their lives navigating illusions. Bogart through the carefully scripted roles of Hollywood, Ava through the way her beauty eclipsed her complexity. In each other, they recognized a kind of authenticity rarely found in their circles. The golden age of Hollywood thrived on such stories. Fans didn't just watch films, they devoured the off-screen narratives that seemed to extend the screenplays into real life. Gardner and Bogart, seen chatting in a corner, became a headline. A smile exchanged at Romanoff's became the stuff of rumor. Whether or not anything romantic truly occurred hardly mattered. What mattered was that audiences wanted to believe. And so, as Ava's star rose higher and Bogart's legend deepened, their occasional intersections became part of Hollywood lore. They were not constant companions, nor did they ever co-star in a film together. But in those fleeting moments when their worlds overlapped, on studio lots, at glittering banquets, in smoky living rooms, the sparks of connection were undeniable. For some, it was enough to imagine the world's most beautiful woman and the screen's most iconic tough guy, sharing laughter in the shadows of Hollywood's golden lights. By the mid-1940s, Humphrey Bogart was no longer just a star, he was a cultural monument. The role of Rick Blaine in Casablanca had secured his immortality, but his real-life love story with Lauren Bacall gave audiences something even rarer: the illusion that Hollywood romance could be genuine. Bacall was only 19 when she first locked eyes with Bogart on the set of To Have and Have Not. He was 45, world-weary, twice divorced, and already a legend. Yet their chemistry on screen spilled over into life with a force that defied skepticism. The press swooned. Here was Bogart, the tough guy who had faced down villains and heartbreaks on screen, undone by a woman half his age whose smoky voice and feline poise became the very symbol of mid-century allure. Theirs was not a simple affair but a seismic collision of souls. Against studio objections and age gap gossip, Bogart married Bacall in 1945, and their union became one of Hollywood's great love stories. Together they were glamorous, witty, defiant, and, by most accounts, deeply in love. Bacall, nicknamed Baby by Bogart, brought tenderness and steadiness to his otherwise rough edges. He, in turn, gave her protection and status in an industry notorious for chewing up young ingenues. Yet even the strongest marriages existed in a Hollywood where temptation was everywhere. The same cameras that celebrated their devotion also searched for cracks, for rumors of betrayal or jealousy. And it was in this ecosystem of longing and speculation that Ava Gardner's name occasionally surfaced. While Bogart was building a life with Bacall, Ava was stumbling through the brutal labyrinth of her own marriages. At just 19, she had wed Mickey Rooney, the pint-sized MGM superstar whose boyish charm on screen masked a reckless appetite for women, parties, and excess. Their union was brief and disastrous, lasting barely a year. Rooney's infidelities were notorious, and Ava, still barely more than a teenager, was left humiliated and disillusioned. Her second marriage, to bandleader Artie Shaw, offered little more solace. Shaw was brilliant, mercurial, and cruelly critical. He reportedly belittled Ava's lack of formal education, dismissing her as nothing more than a pretty face. For a woman of Gardner's sharp wit and sensitivity, those jabs cut deep. The marriage unraveled within a year. But it was Ava's third great entanglement, with Frank Sinatra, that forever branded her as one of Hollywood's most scandalous women. Sinatra, then married to Nancy Barbotto, fell madly in love with Gardner. Their affair became tabloid dynamite, the crooner leaving his wholesome wife for the screen goddess. Their passion was volcanic, alternating between tenderness and violent arguments. Sinatra's career wavered under the weight of scandal, and Ava's reputation as a homewrecker grew. Yet they married in 1951, in a blaze of flashbulbs and disapproval. The marriage was tempestuous, full of love, fights, reconciliations, and ultimately, separation. Still, Sinatra would later call Ava the love of his life. Against this backdrop of chaos in Gardner's personal life, Bogart's stable romance with Bacall seemed like a stark contrast. And yet, Ava and Bogey continued to drift into one another's orbit. The attraction was not necessarily physical, though some whispered it was, but rooted in something deeper, recognition. Bogart saw in Ava not just a beautiful woman, but a survivor. She bore scars, emotional, reputational, professional, just as he did. Both had endured humiliations in their careers and relationships, only to emerge tougher, sharper, more self-aware. The gossip columns feasted on the possibilities. Luella Parsons hinted at a certain closeness between Gardner and Bogart, carefully phrased to avoid outright libel. Hedda Hopper, ever more venomous, suggested Ava was a threat to Bacall, fanning the flames of jealousy. But those who actually knew them spoke differently. John Huston, who directed both Bogart and Gardner at various points, once remarked that they shared a conspiratorial friendship. In his telling, they could exchange a glance across a crowded room and communicate without words. Neither one belonged fully to the society they were forced to inhabit, and in each other, they found relief from the constant performance of Hollywood life. Still, That sense of intimacy was enough to breed speculation. Was Bacall ever threatened by Gardner? Publicly, no. Privately, perhaps. Bacall was famously sharp-tongued, unafraid to defend her territory, and while she and Ava occasionally mingled in the same circles, there was a chill in their exchanges. Some insiders described Bacall as dismissive of Ava's wild reputation, seeing her as reckless compared to her own carefully curated image as Bogart's devoted partner. Ava, for her part, claimed later that she admired Bacall's devotion to Bogey, but couldn't help feeling the irony. She, the Southern girl once dismissed as uneducated and unworthy, could sit across from Bogart, Hollywood's most intelligent cynic, and talk about life with an ease that Bacall, perhaps, did not always share. Bogart and Gardner were not bound by love or lust so much as a kind of shared exile. They both belonged and did not belong to the dream machine. Rumor, however, has a way of shaping history more than truth. A laugh between friends became a clandestine meeting in the gossip columns. A late-night conversation after a party became a whispered affair. For Ava, used to being painted as a seductress, there was little use in denying what people wanted to believe. For Bogart, who preferred silence to spectacle, the rumors rolled off his back. He loved Bacall, of that there was no question. But admiration, even attraction, did not always mean betrayal. The truth of what connected Ava Gardner and Humphrey Bogart remains elusive, precisely because they never sought to clarify it. Their relationship thrived in the shadows, in quiet glances and private conversations rather than public declarations. It was not romance in the storybook sense, nor was it entirely platonic. It was something more ambiguous, the meeting of two restless souls who understood each other in a way the world would never fully grasp. Hollywood thrives on absolutes, great loves, bitter feuds, shocking scandals. But life, and certainly the lives of people as complex as Ava and Bogart, rarely fits neatly into headlines. Theirs was a connection that resisted definition, that survived not because it was shouted from rooftops but because it was whispered in the margins. And so, as the 1950s moved forward, with Bogart cementing his partnership with Bacall and Ava spinning through her fiery marriage to Sinatra, the two continued to share that curious bond. It was not a love triangle in the tabloid sense, but it was a triangle of admiration, loyalty, and unspoken tension. Ava Gardner, the barefoot girl turned goddess. Humphrey Bogart, the cynical tough guy with a hidden tenderness. Lauren Bacall, the young ingenue turned devoted wife. Together they formed a constellation of loyalty and longing, one that still sparks debate decades later. By the mid-1950s, Humphrey Bogart's career was still formidable, but the edges of time and mortality had begun to show. He remained one of Hollywood's most bankable stars, yet there was a new generation rising. Marlon Brando, James Dean, Montgomery Clift, actors who wore their emotions raw, breaking away from the cool restraint of Bogart's era. Still, Bogey's authority remained unmatched. In films like The Caine Mutiny, 1954, he brought a depth that only age and experience could provide, playing flawed men whose cracks revealed the humanity inside. But behind the scenes, a darker battle was brewing. Years of hard drinking and chain-smoking had taken their toll. Bogart, who seemed indestructible on screen, began to lose weight, his once robust presence shrinking into something fragile. By 1956, he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. The news, though kept private for as long as possible, sent shockwaves through his inner circle. Bogart, the icon of toughness, was facing an enemy he could not outwit. Lauren Bacall, steadfast as ever, stood by his side, caring for him with devotion that silenced doubters who had once scoffed at their marriage. She was barely in her early 30s, yet she assumed the role of nurse, protector, and anchor. Friends remembered her as tireless, managing hospital visits, endless medications, and Bogart's moments of despair with a resilience far beyond her years. Ava Gardner, by then dividing her time between Hollywood, Madrid, and London, received the news with a heavy heart. Though her relationship with Bogart had never been defined in conventional terms, she had always carried a certain kinship with him. He was one of the few men in Hollywood who treated her as more than just a beautiful face. For Ava, who was still navigating her tumultuous bond with Sinatra and her growing disenchantment with fame, Bogart's illness was a sobering reminder of life's fragility. She visited when she could, slipping into the Bogarts' home quietly, offering her presence more than her words. Ava was never one for grand gestures. Her loyalty came in silences, in a shared drink, in a squeeze of the hand. The Hollywood community, for all its glamour, had a way of closing ranks in the face of tragedy. Friends like Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, and John Huston rallied around. Poker nights that once roared with laughter became subdued gatherings at Bogart's bedside. Sinatra, though embroiled in his own chaos, made sure to check in. The image of Bogart, the man who had once commanded rooms with his wit and steel, now weakened, hollow-cheeked, was unbearable for many. Yet those closest to him continued to show up, unwilling to abandon him as illness stripped away his armor. On January 14, 1957, Humphrey Bogart died at the age of 57. Hollywood wept. His funeral at All Saints Episcopal Church in Beverly Hills was a spectacle of grief and reverence. The pews were filled with the giants of the industry: Spencer Tracy, Judy Garland, Gary Cooper, Marlene Dietrich, gathered not as stars but as mourners. John Huston delivered the eulogy, his voice breaking as he spoke of Bogart not just as an actor, but as a friend who had faced life with courage and irreverence. Bacall, draped in black, sat in stoic silence, her young face etched with grief that seemed far older than her years. Ava Gardner did not sit in the front pews, nor did she seek attention that day. She mourned in her own way, privately, quietly, her grief tangled with memories only she could fully understand. For Ava, Bogart's death was more than the loss of a colleague or even a friend. It was the closing of a chapter in Hollywood's story, one that had defined so much of her own life. She would later remark to close confidants that Bogart's passing felt like the end of an era, the dimming of a light that had illuminated Hollywood's golden age. In the years that followed, Bogart's legend only grew. Bacall continued her career, carving out her identity beyond being Bogey's wife, though his shadow lingered over every role, every headline. She never remarried during her young widowhood, instead raising their children and carrying forward his memory with dignity. Sinatra, who had adored both Bacall and Ava in different ways, struggled to fill the void left by his old friend. For Ava, middle age brought both freedom and isolation. She had moved far from Hollywood, choosing the cobbled streets of Madrid and later London over the relentless spotlight of Los Angeles. But wherever she went, the past traveled with her. Her marriages had ended, her health was beginning to falter, yet she carried secrets, unspoken truths about friendships and connections that the world would never fully untangle. Bogart was one of those secrets. She rarely spoke of him, perhaps out of respect for Bacall, perhaps because she preferred her memories unspoiled by speculation. Yet those who knew her well sensed that Bogart lingered in her thoughts. A mention of his name would soften her expression. A toast over dinner might include a quiet "here's looking at you, kid," borrowed not from Casablanca but from the private language of people who had shared moments unseen. Ava did not define their bond, nor did she deny the rumors. She carried it like a keepsake, locked away, revealed only when the time felt right. Hollywood, for its part, moved on. The studio system crumbled, the old guard faded, and a new wave of cinema emerged. But the ghost of Bogart remained, not just in films replayed on television, but in the cultural memory of what it meant to be a star. He was grit and romance, cynicism and tenderness, contradictions that refused to be resolved. And in Ava's private recollections, he was also something simpler. A man she admired, a friend she understood, a connection she never forgot. As Ava entered her 50s and 60s, her own health began to decline. Strokes, illness, the toll of years lived with intensity. She remained glamorous, witty, defiant, but her circle grew smaller. In these later years, she finally allowed herself to reflect publicly, working with journalist Peter Evans on her autobiography, Ava, My Story. For the first time, she began to speak, cautiously, about the truths she had long carried. Among them was the acknowledgement that Bogart had mattered to her, deeply, though not in the ways Hollywood would have expected. The shadows of those final days, and the silence that followed, had etched themselves into her memory. She had mourned privately, she had carried secrets into exile, and she had waited until age and illness stripped away the need for discretion before offering the world a glimpse. Humphrey Bogart, to Ava Gardner, was not just a legend on a screen. He was a man whose presence shaped part of her life story, quietly, enduringly, irrevocably. By the mid-1980s, Ava Gardner had lived through more lives than most people could imagine. She had been the barefoot girl from North Carolina, the MGM goddess, the scandalous wife of Frank Sinatra, and the expatriate who found refuge in Madrid's flamenco nights and London's quiet streets. Yet for all the headlines, for all the rumors that swirled around her name, Ava herself had remained curiously silent. She had never chased publicity with the hunger of other stars, never rushed to defend herself against gossip columnists, never written a tell-all book in the heyday of Hollywood confessionals. But time has a way of reshaping perspective. By the mid-1980s, Ava was 67 years old, her beauty still striking but weathered by illness and age. Years of heavy drinking and smoking had taken their toll. She had suffered strokes that left her partially paralyzed, her once dancing legs weakened, her voice roughened. The world she had once dominated had changed beyond recognition. The Hollywood she knew, of studio contracts, dazzling premieres, and larger-than-life stars, was gone, replaced by a more cynical, more fragmented industry. And so, with her health declining and her mortality pressing close, Ava decided it was finally time to tell her story, on her terms. She enlisted journalist Peter Evans to help craft her memoir, Ava, My Story. What began as a collaboration was fraught with tension. Ava was fiercely private, often contradictory, and reluctant to dig too deep into old wounds. Yet she also felt the pull of honesty, the need to reclaim her own narrative before others defined it entirely. "I either write the bloody book or they'll write it for me," she said with her trademark bluntness. In those pages, Ava revealed more than she ever had before. She wrote of her childhood poverty, her meteoric rise, her disastrous marriages, and her endless battle with the double-edged sword of beauty. She did not shy away from her flaws, the reckless affairs, the heavy drinking, the sharp tongue. But she also shared moments of vulnerability, of humor, of insight into what it meant to be both adored and misunderstood. Among the names and stories that surfaced in her reflections, one in particular stood out: Humphrey Bogart. Ava did not dwell on him at great length. Hers was not a tell-all of secret romances, but the way she spoke of him carried a weight that suggested something deeper than casual acquaintance. She described Bogart with a tenderness reserved for very few men in her life, recalling his wit, his integrity, his ability to cut through Hollywood's pretensions. Bogey, she admitted, was one of the real ones. What she revealed was not a scandalous affair or a hidden love story. It was, in a way, more intimate than that. Ava painted a picture of Bogart as a man she admired profoundly, one who treated her as an equal at a time when so many men reduced her to her looks. She hinted at long conversations, at private jokes, at the unspoken understanding that existed between two people who had navigated the brutal realities of fame and still managed to find pieces of themselves intact. Why had she chosen to speak of him now, at 67? Perhaps because time had softened the sharper edges of memory. Perhaps because Bacall, now in her 60s as well, had long since secured her place as Bogart's great love, leaving Ava free to speak without fear of scandalizing the living. Or perhaps it was simply that Ava, staring down the end of her own life, felt the need to honor those connections that had truly mattered. Bogart, for all the brevity of their crossings, had been one of them. Her words reshaped not just her own legacy, but Bogart's as well. For decades, his story had been told almost exclusively through the prism of Bacall, their marriage held up as Hollywood's rare fairy tale. Ava's reflections complicated that picture, not by diminishing Bacall, but by reminding the world that Bogart had been larger, richer, and more multifaceted than any single narrative could capture. He was a man who had mattered deeply to more than one woman, a friend who had left imprints in unexpected places. For Ava, the memoir was a final act of defiance against a world that had so often misunderstood her. Critics had painted her as a wild beauty, a reckless seductress, a woman defined by the men she married. In Ava, My Story, she seized control of her narrative, offering not excuses but context, not apologies but truth. And in speaking of Bogart with respect and affection, she also offered a glimpse of her own heart, guarded, wounded, but still capable of reverence. The book, published in 1990, was met with fascination. Readers devoured her anecdotes, her humor, her candor. They were surprised by her vulnerability, by the way she cut through decades of rumor with a voice that was unmistakably her own. And in those passages where Bogart appeared, readers felt they were glimpsing a hidden chapter in Hollywood history, a friendship, perhaps something more, that had lingered unspoken until Ava, at 67, finally chose to give it shape. Her revelations did not scandalize. Instead, they humanized. They reminded audiences that behind the gossip and the glamour were real people, flawed and complex, who carried secret loyalties and private griefs. For Bogart fans, Ava's words added a layer of warmth to his legacy. For Ava herself, the act of speaking was cathartic, a final confession from a woman who had spent her life oscillating between silence and spectacle. By the time the book was released, Ava's health was failing rapidly. She would die just 2 years later, in 1990, at the age of 67. But in those final years, she had done what she set out to do. She had told her story in her own words, refusing to let anyone else define her. And in those words, she had also preserved Bogart in a way that only she could. Not as the tough guy of Casablanca, not as Bacall's husband, not as a Hollywood legend, but as a man she admired, respected, and perhaps quietly loved. It was, in the end, a final confession. Not explosive, not scandalous, but lasting. A reminder that the stories we tell late in life often reveal the truths that mattered most. Looking back at the lives of Ava Gardner and Humphrey Bogart, it becomes clear that Hollywood history is rarely straightforward. Their stories, like so many written in the haze of studio lights and whispered conversations, are marked by both fact and invention. The truth of their bond may never be fully known, whether it was friendship, flirtation, or something that slipped quietly into love and never returned. What remains is not a precise account but a collection of impressions, memories, and myths that have settled into place over decades. Ava's late-life reflections pulled back the curtain just enough to remind us that behind every carefully crafted image, behind every photograph splashed across magazines, were people grappling with the same complexities as anyone else. Bogart, forever cemented in the public imagination as the cool, unflappable tough guy, carried tenderness and loyalty that often went unseen. Ava, celebrated and objectified for her beauty, revealed herself as sharp, vulnerable, and unwilling to let others write her final chapter. In their separate ways, they stood as survivors of an industry that demanded everything and gave little in return. Their paths crossed in smoky nightclubs, on studio lots, and in the private corners of parties where Hollywood royalty gathered. Each time, something unspoken lingered: admiration, curiosity, maybe even longing. Ava's autobiography did not expose a scandal, but it did illuminate an emotional truth: that Bogart was one of the rare men she respected without reservation, and that respect meant more than any gossip headline ever could. What makes their story compelling is not the certainty of romance but the ambiguity of connection. Hollywood thrives on legends, on filling in the blanks with speculation until the myth feels truer than the life itself. In the case of Gardner and Bogart, the myth is as powerful as any film role they ever played. Perhaps they were confidants, perhaps fleeting lovers, perhaps simply kindred spirits in an unforgiving world. Each possibility adds another shade to the portrait of who they were, and what they meant to one another. By the time Ava finally spoke at 67, she had nothing left to lose and no one left to protect. Her words came not as revelations designed to shock, but as fragments of memory, selective, imperfect, deeply human. Memory, after all, is never a reliable witness. It blurs, edits, exaggerates, and softens with age. And yet it is memory, not fact, that endures. That is the final legacy of Ava Gardner and Humphrey Bogart. Not the precise details of what they did or did not share, but the way their names continue to be spoken together, the way their stories intertwine in the cultural imagination. The blurred lines between truth and myth have become their monument. Sometimes what lasts is not what really happened. Sometimes it is what we choose to remember, and how those memories shape the legends we pass down. And in that sense, Ava Gardner and Humphrey Bogart will always remain bound together, not by certainty, but by the enduring power of remembrance.